So, just as Ta-Nehisi Coates' Between the World and Me is about racist violence, Rebecca Solnit's Men Explain Things to Me is about sexist violence. Um, Both of these books document such violence in pretty horrifying detail. Um, and relate statistics of violence against black people and women. But neither of these writers are principally concerned with actual manifest violence. Uh, they're more concerned specifically with the violence entailed by being socially disregarded, silenced, um, uh, taken for granted, and being dispensable. That's to say, living in a society whose self image, whose dream, in Coates's term, of itself, who dreams of itself as just and equal, dreams of itself as caring about justice and equality, um, even while significant demographic groups like black people and women are subject to unpredictable and unaccountable violence. So what there's a violence inherent in social normalcy. So I want to just say parenthetically, although I won't be delving into the topic too much, that it's important to point out that these are two different perspectives on ideological violence in terms of race on the one hand and gender on the other. But they're not by no means mutually exclusive. On the contrary, of intersectionality and how the overlapping of these categories brings new levels and specific forms of vulnerability and violence that warrant specific attention in their own right. But we're talking about more generally in terms of the topic of our course, nonfiction prose, the representation of reality, the concern I want you to be thinking about is what's at stake in the pretense to represent social reality objectively, who has the privilege to do so, who has the prerogative to do so, who has the prerogative to speak and be heard, and who gets left out, who is experience doesn't count, it doesn't matter. So, just to get you thinking about it, the discrepancy between productivity and compensation since the early 70s, and that how that seems to be related and to the development of digital technology that's made work more productive, more profitable. But those profits have not gone to the workers at the same rate that it's gone to the management or shareholders of companies. So that's just to illustrate a sort of general trend in disregarding the time and value of labor, the experience of bodies in general, and the workers who are you could argue, not responsible for these increases in products in productivity. If in fact it's a matter of increases in technological efficiency, you might argue, and many people do, that well, why shouldn't it go to the shareholders, investors in the company who paid for that development of new technology. Um, uh, but this is, I think, a very suspicious and dangerous kind of argument, because it reduces the work to ancillary, what's called resource labor rather than creative labor, kind of raw material, analogous to um, a natural resource that's just getting maximally exploited. So, you know, there was never any work, labor that wasn't dependent upon technology. The labor has always been it has always incorporated technology in some way or another. Their actual time um, uh, spent operating this technology, it does create this value that they aren't being compensated for. Um, uh, okay, so that was pretty long-winded, but I think it's. I wish I would, was better versed in economics to explain it better, but I go into it in detail because it's just such a huge reality of the world we live in, and especially that you live in. So, yeah, I think it's important to understand it. So that's everybody. So turning now to get a more specific view on the disregard of women's bodies, and even dispensability of women's bodies. Consider this recent op-ed arguing that the entirely uncompensated, entirely unrecognized value of domestic work, and work caring for the family, household work and taking care of relatives, dwarfs the uh, actual income of corporations. So imagine you had a bucket big enough to hold all the money made in 2018 by the 50 biggest companies in the world. The 10.9 trillion that women didn't earn would more than fill it. The monstrous economic exploitation of women that's taken for granted, that goes without saying, that's silenced, is paralleled. The monstrous level of underreporting and under-prosecution of sexual violence. So this indicates to me, first of all, people might quibble about these statistics. I think that's beside the point. I think that the point that we're discussing is massive systemic distortion of what counts as normal and objective in society. So how massive is not an insignificant question, but what I think is beyond dispute is that there is uh, gross distortion in the normal perception of what counts as objective justice and inequality, which in particular treats black bodies, women's bodies, black labor, women's labor, and time, to think also about the incarceration rates, and that's our concern in this course. Is how do we talk about reality? How do we write nonfiction prose in this context where real bodies are really suffering? So the silencing that Solnit is talking about is it goes very deep. It's not just about not hearing the experience of victims of economic and sexual exploitation and violence. It's about not the victims themselves not even being able to recognize it. Solnit, talks about women who said that why I didn't even know this wasn't normal. That this wasn't that this such exploitation, that there was even anything wrong, or I had any right to expect anything different. So silencing not just by the outside world, to the outside world, but to oneself. I will relate a personal story, or something that relates to me, but it's not. I don't think actually that personal. The point that Solnit is making is that this is, and Coates as well, is that the violence that they're talking about is systemic. It's part of normalcy. There's nothing, especially. It's not about unique cases. It's about something that's built into our normal world. So my mother, I mean, she, I was raised by a single mom, and she was, she was assaulted at gunpoint at one point. We had to move because she was being stalked, and so she was very familiar with I don't know, sexually predatory behavior during her adult life. But she, a couple of years ago, her dad died relatively recently, and she'd been reminiscing with her sister about growing up together, and they were talking about going to parties and when they in high school, and just sort of recounting old memories. My mom said she was like, all of a sudden she was like, Jesus, I didn't realize I was raped. Like, I forgot about it, or I didn't even realize it at the time. I didn't register like there, or maybe that word wasn't available to me then. That it's since become available. And that was during the '60s, like the women's movement, the sense of the political new sense of political empowerment and women's rights was a lot more conscious than it was for, say, my mom's mom, not to mention all the generations before that. This is what Solent means by obliteration. This disregard or dispensability that's bearing witness to this vanishing violation of women's personhood or mattering. that she puts in this paradoxical way. Obliteration keeps showing up. It's like vanishing keeps appearing. Um, and that's, it's, I think it's, she's talking about feeling like a ghost in one's own reality, in the same way that I think Coates' title, Between the World and Me, evokes. Solnit refers to it in this paradoxical phrase: obliteration keeps showing up. Um, Paradoxical because it's sort of akin to saying vanishing, obliteration, elimination, erasure. It keeps appearing. Like, how does absence become present? Um, I'd like you to think about that paradox. But again, it's using a poetic figure paradox to try to do justice to a reality that can't be addressed directly without implicating oneself in the very silencing that she's trying to talk about. Um, So, um, another complication, or another, I think, tonal feature, formal feature of Solnit's nonfiction prose. Um, how would you describe her tone, especially in the title essay, Men Explain Things to Me? Um, it's what strikes me is the emphasis on laughter and the ridiculousness. She says after this episode of being silenced by this man, uh, once she and her girlfriend were out of earshot, they started laughing and have never stopped. Um, that also characterizes her the next episode she describes with the translator. She's sort of um, in a self-effacing way. She says, "Feel the shame, dude. Like, if you're reading this, feel the shame." Like, she's um, self-deprecating, it seems to me, about her own experience of being silenced. Um, Even while she's putting it on this continuum, this slippery slope, on a continuum with very harrowing, I mean, horrifying um, accounts of violence that are extremely difficult to read. So that's a tonal question that I'd like you to consider. Um, this juxtaposition of laughter with horror. Um, how are we supposed to, if it is a slippery slope, if silencing, if, as she says, credibility is a survival tool, being silenced in any way is subjects you to violence. So violence is always at stake. What does it mean? What is the place for laughter in such a context? It's a question raised by her prose style. One beginning of a explanation or account of Solnit's style, I think, has to do with her resistance of dogmatism and openness to mystery. What Alison Gopnik talked about in terms of exploration, curiosity, um, which Solnit thematizes in the essay on Woolf, Virginia Woolf, and keeping the uh, future obscure and uncertain. Um, so that's a important and hard um, balancing act to manage in the face of the, I think, dire reality that she documents with all these anecdotal accounts and statistics of the pervasive violence against women. Um, so here we see in this passage, we see her rejection of certainty, rejection of objectivity, of taking a merely kind of fact-oriented perspective. Despair is a form of certainty. That's a powerful line. Despair is a form of certainty. There's a kind of assurance or dogmatism in being definitively despairing. Optimism is similarly confident about what will happen. Both are grounds for not acting. So that's key, I think, in illuminating as well. She's putting the priority on acting, on doing, over knowing. What's sacred is the perpetuating the conversation, perpetuating one's agency in the world, rather than simply knowing it, regardless how bleak what you seem to know is. Hope can be the knowledge that reality doesn't necessarily match our plans. So there's devaluing of the intellect. She describes the intellect as a kind of vengeance upon the world, preferring to understand the world rather than engage it as a participant. I prefer to just understand it as an observer. So here we see her in various ways prioritizing the practical engagement of life over the mere understanding of it, and I just think that's important to bear in mind, because the so much of the power of her text comes from her documentation of facts, historical facts, and statistics. I, Wordsworth put this very well. We murder to dissect. To understand things, we have to objectively, we have to kind of kill them in order to fix our understanding of things and knowledge. We have to freeze the world in a kind of as an object of clinical scrutiny. The deadening effect of objective understanding, Solnit describes in really vivid, evocative metaphors. In order to objectify, to reduce things to facts and linear causal explanations, a forest must be narrowed down to a tree, a web down to a line. It's maybe the key image, I think, in this text. A web must be narrowed down to a line to construct a linear narrative of blood, that's ancestry, cultural influence, or meaning. So what she's using metaphors here, and moreover, she's using them to prioritize form over content, meaning. She's saying what matters more is the web of interrelations, the web of conversations, of multiple perspectives, over a single determinate meaning or narrative, linear narrative. What matters more is the interplay of many different perspectives, a web, a forest. So she's using metaphors here, but these are metaphors for the importance of form, such as metaphors, over content, the meaning of a story, the lesson of a story, and the objective content or facts of history. So, what does it mean to avoid the reduction of the forest to the tree or the web to the line? Reduction of the complex web of reality into the uh, simple meanings of facts and linear narratives. Um, I think labor is a good term for it. Work. Um, and it's elaborated in different ways. I'm going to just discuss a little bit um, Rousseau's idea of the social contract and Hegel, the German philosopher Hegel's idea of the master-slave dialectic. Um, so, um, uh, Rousseau suggests that civilization began with this proprietary claim, the claim to own. He makes a further point that Hegel will build on, that in nature, there's no place for domination in nature. It doesn't make any economic sense. There's no reason to pretend to own anything. Um, you can prevail over another organism or circumstance in your environment, subdue some kind of obstacle or opponent, but you have no reason to claim to own it. You subdue it for whatever reason, and or however is necessary in those circumstances, even kill it or destroy it, but then you move on. There's no reason to own. It doesn't make any economic sense. It's not worth your time to own anything in nature. Um, that only becomes uh, economically profitable and viable in the context of law, of the holding things fixed and steady in that manner of the left brain. So Hegel developed this master-slave dialectic to explain the dynamic of domination in human society, and in particular, this pretense to possessive individuality, um, to be an owner, master, to own land, let alone to own a person. So Hegel imagines this kind of primal duel or conflict of sort of at the beginning of civilization, like if Rousseau said, in nature, there's no reason to own, but at some point, just imagine uh, uh, as a kind of thought experiment. There's at some point there became two individuals, each equally invested in being the owner, being in control of a piece of land or a wife or whatever. They're both. It was mutually exclusive. It was like one or the other could inhabit this position of being the master, the owner, um, and this resulted in what is a subsequent follower of Hegel's called the fight to the death for pure prestige. um, this social prestige of being seen as the one who owns, the one who is in control. That's what's different from nature. In nature, it's just you win or you don't win. You win, and you prevail or you don't, then you move on. But what's at stake in civilization, in culture, is the prestige of the claim to control. Um, Hegel's point about this duel is it's totally accidental who wins. It's not, um, uh, again, it's not a natural achievement or um, uh, accomplishment. It doesn't reflect. It can't be retraced to any natural attribute like superior strength, um, because what's stake again is the social prestige of the this new cultural ideal of ownership. Um, so Hegel imagines, these two fighting to the death, and sooner or later one blinks or one submits and says, "I'd rather survive than die for the sake of this prestige." Um, and so one becomes the master and one becomes the slave. Um, and Hegel's story is that an ironic reversal happens at that point, um, because while it seems like the master has prevailed and got what he wanted, um, if you think about how that actually plays out, um, the consequences again are ironic. Because for the master, in order to believe to have his status as master sustained, he actually is dependent on the slave. The master needs the slave in order to reflect his own mastery back to him. Um, so, because again, it's an arbitrary social fantasy. Being a master, it's an ideal. It's not. There's no natural qualification for it. It's a social fantasy that we, that there's rivalry over, but once one wins, maintaining belief in that requires the slave somehow perpetually demonstrate it. So there's a deep psychological insight at play here, um, which is gruesomely demonstrated throughout history, that masters. Unlimited coercive power makes people sadistic, because they never. There's nothing can satisfy it. Nothing can satisfactorily prove to me that I deserve the this unlimited power that I have. So that it results in an inclination to sadism. The most vivid demonstration of this is the Stanford prison experiment, where undergraduates at Stanford in the 60s were arbitrarily divided into guards and prisoners, and the guards were given sort of absolute control over them. And within a day or two, they became so outrageously, sadistically mistreating the prisoners that they had to call off the experiment early. But you see it all the time, police, or whenever anyone has unchecked coercive power over other people, there's a strong inclination to abuse it, not because it's fun, but because you don't really understand why you have it, and it's sort of aggravating, and in a way, so you take out your aggravation on the um, person that you have control over. Um, So that's a long-winded way of showing how the master becomes the slave of the slave. The roles get reversed. Um, on the other hand, um, the part of the reason why this can never reflect back to the master and satisfying image of himself as the master can never explain or substantiate that he embodies that ideal. Um, it's because the master makes a mistake. The slave does not submit to the master. He submits to death. He submits to his fear of death. He doesn't. It's not. I'm not. It's not that I'm so scared of you. I mean, I'm not so awestruck by you that I'm speaking now as the slave that submits to the master. It's that I'm awestruck by death. I don't want to die, and you're going to kill me. So I'm submitting to my fear of death. And the master mistakes that as a fear of me, as if I'm the Lord. But in Hegel's terms, there is only one master, absolute master, and that's death. We are all mortal. We all submit to the power, the authority of death, and the inscrutability of it, the understandability of it. That's the only true master. And so that's what the slave submits to. So while the master's identity is exhausted entirely by the vain desire to see itself reflected back in the obedience of the slave, the slave has ability to work in the world in a way that, to be sure, is in to a greater or lesser degree prescribed by the master, but not exhaustively prescribed. And there's a kind of marginal freedom to undertake his work on his own terms. Part of this dynamic is that the master is lost in his head, filled with contempt for the body and the earth, which are infinitely unsatisfying, infinitely unable to satisfactorily substantiate his self-image as the master. Whereas the slave is curious and open to possibilities offered by the earth and the body, to the expressive possibilities opened by the earth and the body. So that there's relative freedom of expression and of communication. So that the slave is, the work of the slave becomes the source of culture and social life. And this, again, is very, I think, vividly demonstrated by history. Culture always arises from the grassroots in society, fashion, music, always is generated by the circumstantial creativity that isn't normatively prescribed, but that is discovered through interaction with material circumstances. So another aspect to this is, has been elaborated philosophically in various ways in terms of phallogocentrism. So that's patriarchy, um, the concern for rationality, language. We can, correlate this in the terms of our course with Ta-Nehisi Coates' description of the dream, or Solnit's description of mansplaining. This presumption to neutral understanding, disembodied, transcendent of material circumstances. This phallogocentrum, this kind of these various sorts of abstraction, has to do with the denigration of the body and the earth. This idea of mastery, the possessive individuality. It's also correlated with vision in the terms that Ian McGilchrist talks about, and there's a kind of phallic valorization of standing above the earth, looking down on the creatures that crawl upon the earth, being the pretense to see, to stand above the earth and survey reality from a kind of a presumption of detachment, of kind of godlike omniscience, panopticism, all-seeing, that is quite, correlated with our idea of science and enlightenment. This knowledge is correlated with disembodiment, and so a kind of disparaging of the persecution of the body. If knowledge is correlated with embodiment, then the objects of knowledge become especially denigrated kinds of bodies. They're merely inert objects when they become objects of knowledge, or of possession. So that's what I mean to say that this phallogocentrum doesn't just gender knowledge or correlate the law with male gender, but it also adds a new kind of denigration to the earth and the body. Only the master sees the body as inert matter, as opposed to mind. It creates this, Cartesian dualism, the separation of body and mind on the model of master and slave. Creates a newly debased body, a body that it just exists as an object or potential object of violence. And I think that's, also the Genesis story of Adam and Eve. That's how the female body is the deserving victim of the consequences of sexuality. Sorry, I'm running out of light here. So I'll finish up. I'll get to back to Solnit in subsequent video. But I want to finish up this discussion. I've really been focusing on the sort of paradoxes of the master. But the real point of this master-slave dialectic is the liberation of the slave, the way in which the slave demonstrates what freedom means through Hegel characterizes his work. I suggest in terms of labor and as a way of like correlating the female body, the pains of childbirth, the labor, the work of the female body. So if the master is sort of lost in his head and violently acting out against the world for its failure to substantiate his sense of himself as master, his impossible, pursuit of this otherworldly ideal of control and ownership. By contrast, the slave exists only in time, only in embodied time. That's the only reality the slave knows. The slave chose life over death. I want to survive. Again, going back to that video about learning to ride a bike, it's out of a sense of survival. I'm persisting and aware and, in Gopnik's terms, curious and experimental and open to explore the opportunities that the world's, our actual time, our actual environment, our actual body makes available. This is and also aware of mortality. It's choosing life, choosing existence and an awareness of mortality. This also amounts to an invention of what work is. Work is what work does. It creates a social conversation among workers of mutual recognition, of a mutual recognition of how we inhabit our bodies and perform our work. That's what culture is. I want to try to begin to draw this back to Solnit by talking about rights and the way in which she emphasizes a kind of unacknowledged history that goes from abolition of slavery through the acquisition of suffrage for women and reproductive rights to just recently rights for sexual minorities, queer rights. These progressive social movements on a deeper level are about concern for embodiment, concern for the predicament of bodies. The figure of the web, that's what I think she's getting at here. It's that history is a web of interplay. This video is about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And I like it because it's set to music. Solnit's book, she discusses this gorgeous painting, it's a very paradoxical painting. Its gorgeousness is paradoxical. It's about covering and all that, the violence that that sort of suffocation entails. This is an image of the obliteration, the silencing that Solnit is concerned about in this book. But it's also an occasion of expression and a kind of formal creativity that maybe transcends the limited terms of concepts in the same way music does. I think the video also suggests how work is what work does. Likewise with rights. What a right means, the right to free speech, to assembly, to privacy. we discover that through work. There's nothing absolute about these concepts. We discover what they mean by applying them to actual situations, and that's why that's the logic of this web of transference among of rights among different groups. Um, anyway, so I just like how this video takes these terms, the abstract terms of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and turns it into a kind of dance, a dance of application to the world. Um, and that's what I think the work of the slave is about, and it's as exemplified in blues music, the tremendous legacy of blues music for um, of all culture, and like this image, it's about pain, as Solnit says about it. The woman who is represented is obscured, but the woman who represents is not. The act, the agency of representation, the agency of speaking, somebody's speaking through this image of an obscured or silenced figure, has the same kind of paradoxical structure as blues music. Speaking about pain becomes a means of self-expression.